Hi, I'm Larry May. I'm a husband and a dad and a grandpa. And for the last 18 months, I've been serving as state director for Indiana Kids Belong. And we're an organization that exists to dramatically improve the experience and outcomes of kids in Indiana's foster care system. I came across a familiar passage of scripture in my devotional time this past weekend. It's one of my favorites. It's in Romans 12:2 and 3. It says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." So what's most familiar to me about this passage and what I've gone back to many times in my life is the part where the writer, Paul, says that we're transformed by the renewal of our minds. In other words, just changing how I think about myself and my circumstances can have a huge transformational impact on me and on others. But what really stood out to me this past weekend about this passage, and something I've been grappling with a lot this year, is the part about the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. If you ask people who know me well, I think they would describe me with words like confident and busy and hardworking and somebody who likes to get things done, make things happen. I'm kind of an addict to achievement and making an impact. I was raised by two very hardworking parents who taught their three boys, not by what they said, but by how they lived. They taught us just to do life in such a way that if you want to get somewhere, you have to do it yourself. So very much self-achievement kinds of upbringing for all three of us boys. And if something needs to be done, you got to do it yourself. And this kind of thinking is not all bad. I mean, certainly it's a good thing to take the initiative, but it doesn't always leave much room for the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And what I mean by that is often I think I know what's best, and my tendency is to sort of go heads down, full speed, and make sure what I think is best is what happens. And when things don't go my way, I find it frustrating. So I think what the Lord has been teaching me lately, and what He reminded me of in this passage this past weekend, is that I can trust His will, and I can do so especially when things don't go my way, when it's not my will. So even though I'm wired for making an impact and working hard and being confident about where I'm headed and being intentional about getting there, I may not have the market cornered on what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. In other words, I don't always know what's best, and I need to leave room to trust God's sovereignty when things don't go the way I think they should. So I started in my new role with Indiana Kids Belong about a year and a half ago. And while I've seen some amazing and encouraging things happen, there have been numerous situations that haven't turned out the way I expected them to or wanted them to. I haven't handled it well in many cases. I find myself being overly confident of how things should turn out, and then working really hard to control those outcomes to make them turn out the way I want. And then, of course, being frustrated when they don't. In other words, as Paul puts it in this scripture passage that I read a few minutes ago, I think more highly of myself than I ought to think by presuming that my will is God's will. I read a book a few years ago entitled One Word, and at the author's suggestion, instead of doing New Year's resolutions for the last 4 years, I've just been selecting a single word each year that sort of encapsulates the area of change or growth that I want to see in my life each year. So this year, my one word is surrender. And when you think of surrender, you probably think of a definition more like ceasing to resist or losing a war. But what the word surrender means to me in 2021, and what I'm asking the Lord to teach me this year, is to surrender to His will over my best thinking. To surrender to His sovereignty, churchy word there, even though if outcomes don't look like what I would have envisioned. This is hard for me. I probably shouldn't be having to learn this at age 61, but that's where I am today. And my prayer for you and for me is simply this, and I'm just going to read a prayer that I hope you can identify with as I close. Lord, give me energy and passion and intentionality to live the life you've called me to, but please don't let me think so much of myself that I think I know your will all the time. And when things don't go my way, help me to remain a constant state of surrender to your good and acceptable and perfect